everybody's refreshed and ready to go. We're to the bond proposal plan tonight, and Al, I know Al Soroki is going to come forward. Before you get started, Al, I just wanted to quickly recap for everybody. It's been about a month since the plan was first, the plan we had in front of us was first put out May 14th. 2 weeks ago tonight, we reviewed that plan. And as part of that discussion, the district said that they were going to bring some additional plans to us to look at tonight, in addition to the one that's been on the table since then. So we appreciate that, and that's where we are tonight, to hear some plans and decide what action to take and how to move forward for the next steps. And I also wanted to make a comment or two about you, Al, and Andy Jenks. In the last couple of weeks, you two guys have been out there sharing the plan, if you will. Al, you've been working on this thing for a couple of years, since the day you got here, developing the plan, and a lot of work. And I know in the last 2 weeks, I don't know exactly what you're gonna say tonight, but I know you've done an amazing amount of work just to get here with alternative plans in a short time. And I know the two of you have been out talking to the community. Andy, you have, and I know board members have. And because I've heard your name a lot, both of you. And I say that with all due respect. You guys are the messengers, and your task has been to come out and explain why we're here, why we did this, why our plan is here. Where sometimes our board task has been more oriented toward, yes, this is the plan, and we're listening to input here, and I'll take that back to the full board at the board meeting or whatever. And there's sometimes the messengers get a little beat up when all they have to do is try and explain to people what's going on, and people are rightfully concerned. And I also would say a big thank you to the community, and I mean that on behalf, I think, of the entire board. The community's been very engaged, and that's important, and we know people will stay engaged. This is a big deal, a $300 million bond, new schools. How are we gonna get there? We haven't been doing this for years. I mean, we've needed a capital needs plan, we have one. We've needed a county commissioners who see it as one of their important missions, and that is to find a way to help both school districts do some new school building or replace parts of buildings and renovate. We just haven't had this focus, so it's a critical, important time. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank both of you for the work you've done to get us here today. We appreciate it. And with that, Al, I'm going to turn it over to you and tell us what we're doing here.
All right. First of all, good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board, Dr. Hamlet, and guests. It's my pleasure tonight to provide you with some feedback as far as the direction that you provided to us as a staff to be able to kind of go back and take this optimized plan that really ultimately did not incorporate any of the values that you as a board or our community really took into consideration. It was strictly about putting kids into the newest facilities at the least amount of cost, if you want to call it that, and then allowing us to take all of that information and come back with some plausible scenarios. I do appreciate the grace that you gave our team, knowing that it's been about 2 weeks since the last meeting, and our team has had to work all the way up until this afternoon and being able to produce a final product that had been vetted, edited, enough to make sure that lay people, to the best of our ability, can understand what ultimately is very complex when you look at the pieces of the puzzle. So I do appreciate that. And I would also just like to iterate for folks that are maybe hearing this the first time, and I'm going to have slides that have to stand on their own from each presentation. I'm trying not to repeat slides from the past, but knowing that we have new folks that are hearing it, there are some things that I do have to say, and I'll try to move past those for the sake of time, but they do need to be there. So I want you to know that. It's been a cumulative piece, and we've done our best to provide you with scenarios that we believe are viable solutions that could be accomplished. I'm not suggesting, unless you ask me for feedback, which ones I believe are more viable than others or which ones meet. We did the qualitative analysis that you'll see in the presentation where it takes those values and we kind of use the stoplight approach, use some basic standards, and you're going to see that. But I'm going to try my best to walk through those and do it in a way in which you can keep them straight. But I'll be able to give you kind of keywords. If you start asking about plans, I may remind you that that plan means that we're doing this, 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 and this, so that we ensure that we're just all on the same page in that conversation. So in starting, I'm going to go over remind everyone about the approach that the district in Orange County has taken, talk a little bit about the recommendations that came from Wolford, our community input that we've received on the plan, then those bond plan options, first cut at some scenarios, as well as looking at the decision-making values and criteria, which is the dashboard that you will see at the end. The biggest piece I want to share in this process, and you actually teed it up well, Dr. Griffin, this is new for us as a district. You know, we have never had the opportunity where we can come in and try to develop anything that's even close to a short and a long-term plan. But as we've been going through this, you know, the county is the ones that are responsible for maintaining our buildings, and they, through the capital work group, created this committee that ultimately looked at it. And it's been trailblazing for the county commissioners as well. This is not, they've done bond referendums, but they've really never done a referendum where they've played a very active part in helping determining the needs as they are. So I say that meaning that we're all trailblazing here as we move forward, but this is the trailblazing in a very positive way because we've never had this opportunity to even consider $187 million over 10 years to replace what I've always said are 2 elementaries, a middle, 2 middles and elementary, or 3 elementaries. And that's really what $187 million will get you. But we've never had that ability. We've been able to replace possibly 1 school back in 2016 with Chapel Hill High. But beyond that, we've not had that ability. We've only added schools over time when capacity allowed. So again, just tying into our strategic plan, our approach, you know, the core of our plan, and you're going to see that we needed to focus not just on the facility assessment itself, but we also wanted to look at the capacities at our elementary, middle, and high school levels. You have seen that with capacities, there is room or empty seats at the elementary level that's projected over the long term, but the middle and high, once again, over the 10-year period, we're not looking to change that capacity at all. The county has indicated that there's no need to add additional schools for capacity reasons in our district or even Orange County for the next 10 years. So everything we're doing is about rehabilitation, replacement of schools. Looking for operational and structural inefficiencies, that's a goal that we've had in our plan. We've looked at educational adequacy, and that's a cornerstone of what the county has taken. As far as the size of the classrooms that were built in 1958, 1962, and do they match size of classrooms that are built in modern school design and DPI standards today. And then looking just for short-term, long-term, reactive versus proactive type strategy. We know that the means is not enough for the need, and that we have to go with the schools that we believe, based upon the consultant's report, are the ones that are the most needy. But we also know that we have multiple schools that have needs, and we're going to have a phase 1 and a phase 2. Phase 2 will ultimately be another referendum in another 10 years. So for the goals, it's pretty much the same. We're not taking the Band-Aid approach, doing our best not to do that. We want to lower the facility condition index in our buildings, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means again. We want to add new schools where appropriate. We want to try to incorporate our community input and values. Consider down the road realigning our school boundaries. It doesn't have to be an essential part of this plan, but it is an important piece, knowing that we have schools that have capacity, and we have other schools that are at or exceed capacity. So there's an opportunity to try to correct that over time in a way that is the least disruptive to our students. The Orange County approach, I shared this at the last presentation. They have established the guidelines that we have to follow as a district when it comes to approving on an annual basis our capital investment plan. The projects have to be based upon the consistency of the Wolford plan, meaning we cannot add, I'll use an example, a swimming pool to a school project. That was not something that Wolford assessed, so we couldn't add that. We couldn't add a natatorium to a building. It's not something that they assessed. They want us to replace old facilities with new facilities. They're not looking for renovations. And when I say renovations, they're asking us not to go in and to gut buildings and not move walls around. Because if you don't move the walls around, then you're not addressing educational adequacy because classrooms are still undersized. So they don't want to put millions of dollars into a building and then still have educational adequacy be an issue. At the same time, they know that knowing that we can only fund 3 to 4 schools at most, they understand that the rest of our portfolio has high priority maintenance that Wolpert has identified. And we have to ensure that we have a plan for the schools that are not really going to be impacted by replacement in the first phase, but that they're going to get essential work done in their buildings, such as roofing, air conditioning, electrical, finishes and such as that. Wolpert identified for our district over the 10-year need that we were just over $573 million in need, out of which they have been successfully able to allocate $187.7 million in funding for new schools. That's the number that I just used as far as the number of schools that potentially we could work with. In addition, there's about $93 million that can be used for ongoing major maintenance. And this is not just using bond and PAYGO money, but it's also utilizing existing lottery, annual capital, and even deferred maintenance monies in order to do that. I am very pleased that this past week, the county commissioners approved the CIP for fiscal year 25 for our district. There is an additional $9 million of deferred maintenance that's coming effective July 1 that we will be using for essential maintenance projects in our buildings that Wolpert has identified. And as you recall, when the CIP was presented to you a few months ago, there's an additional $9 million coming in FY26. So there's an additional total of $18 million for deferred maintenance coming from the county before, if the bond was to be passed and that money was to become available. So we're not sitting doing nothing for the next 2 years. We're actually able to get work done over the course of the 2 years. Under Wolpert's recommendations, a few things I just want to remind everyone about. The FCI, the Facility Condition Index, that is the financial cost to get a building up to the best condition in comparison to the price to replace it. So your numerator is the cost you would invest, the denominator is the price to replace it. FCI is not the only indicator or the tool in the toolbox that you would use to determine that a school needs to be replaced. As you recall, the example I continually use is Wolpert said that Carborough High School had a 10-year FCI of just over 70%. 70% would make you think the school should be replaced. Carborough High School is about 25 years of age. It still has good bones. We would not tear that building down because it had a 71% FCI. It's just the iteration of the building is at a point where you need to replace HVAC, you need to replace roofing and electrical. It's the essential. Just like in our homes, you have major capital work that has to be done. So I just remind folks, facility condition is just one thing that you look at, but you could have high numbers and low numbers, and you still might want to replace that school. The biggest piece that I will say when it comes to looking at FCI is also looking at the age of the school and the educational adequacy within that building. You know, old is old. If you have a school that's built in 1958, there's a point where you just have to make the decision that that school has served its purpose. That is a balance, though, in what has been invested in that building over that time. Because we do have some older schools that have had substantial investment, and they're not at the top of the list, but they're older schools. Because as a district, there were things that had to be done in years past. Whereas we have other schools that are the same age, for whatever reason, we did not invest in those schools. And those schools are, I will say, hemorrhaging at this point because of those decisions, right or wrong. This is a slide just for the public to see for a defining of educational adequacy, and it talks about looking at the spaces. The best thing that I always say is where you take the design of a room from 1958 and you compare it to the modern size room. You look at that to see, does it give you the flexibility to do what you need to do. In the Wolpert report, we had several schools that were undersized with FCI, but when it comes to programs, our EC population classrooms had the greatest challenges, given the fact of the amount of resources and equipment and people that are necessary in those classrooms. So that is something as a district that we wanted to focus on. Orange County Schools in the same position. Again, so when you look at decision making, there's just a variety of issues. The one that I will elaborate a little further on is, for us, is that we have physically limited land on our school sites. We have a few schools where you could build adjacent to an existing school and you replace it, but most of our schools do not allow that to occur. The land is very limited and just doesn't prevent you from allowing you to do that process. Again, land is a premium here, the Chapel Hill Carborough community. Orange County, they have certain areas where land is a premium, but they have other areas where there is ample land. We're in a different boat here. As you will see, and I have mentioned, when we build, if we land that we have, even existing, we have to build up. We have to build smarter and have less of an impervious footprint on our sites to maximize green space, but also to address lots of environmental issues. Knowing that the topography within our school district, a lot of our schools were built with areas of land where the topography, if you built it today, you wouldn't have been able to build the school that you did back in 1962 on that site the way that you did. And we have to bring this up to standards. So a few of our sites, looks like they have a lot of land, but then when you actually go to develop it, you find that your developable land is very limited in comparison. In some of our schools, not all. So these are the schools that Wolpert surfaced, and you will see that this slide, we have added since our last presentation an additional school. We've added Phillips Middle School as one, knowing that Phillips is on the Estes Hills Phillips Middle School campus, and that Phillips Middle is part of the critical path in order to be able to ultimately replace both of those schools and allow that school property to be revitalized and to continue to be a vibrant part of the community. So we've added that, and the thing that I would want you to look at is you can look at the FCI, and you see that there's numbers that range from 37 all the way up to 80%. But when you go over to meeting size requirements, that's the educational adequacy. That's where we're lacking. And you will see that Phillips is at 37%. So when you compare Phillips to Colbreth, there's a 7-year age difference between the schools. Colbreth was one that had a higher FCI because there's a point where it just needs to have roofing and HVAC done in the building. But the bottom line is when it comes to the actual size of the rooms under adequacy, Phillips is a contender because it's my understanding that that 37% is one of the lowest out of the entire Wolpert report between both districts. So it's an item to note, and we spoke with a consultant and got their feedback, and they concurred that this is a school to definitely consider as well as we deliberate on our scenarios. So the limitations of land, these are examples. You've seen these in previous, but I wanted to show how Phillips and Estes Hills, we have a site where there's a pretty big topographic difference between the football field and the actual campus on that site. But you've got a school obviously on the right and the left, and there's very little land in the middle other than what's down at the football field area that could be developed. But there's a lot of challenges there. So the premise here has been ultimately to look at, take the school that needs to be replaced first, if it's Estes Hills or if it's Phillips, replace that school first, and then replace the latter on the other site. So doing a swap over time. Obviously, it's an elementary and a middle school, and that's about $70 million in today's dollars for a middle school, and it's about $50 million for an elementary school. So about $120 million investment for design, site development, and construction, based upon Wolpert's estimates. We show Carborough Elementary. Carborough, though it looks like it has a lot of land, it's part of the land is a huge, I will call it a swale, that a lot of water comes down, and there's a bike trail. Has challenges. From an initial assessment, we would say that you need to build the school where the building is on the highest point of that land. But that would allow you to maximize that space. So it's just showing you how it can be limited. Colbreth Middle, that is one school where we believe that we are able to build a 2- or 3-story middle school structure in this image on the left side of on the athletic fields and possibly some of the land that's in the front of the building in order to keep those students within the building. So this is a school where we believe there's some viability in not having to move students out while you replace. Frank Porter Graham, which is just on the other side of the bypass where we're here tonight, is a school that's very limited when it comes to land, but it is backed up to Morgan Creek, which you're aware floods. And then you've obviously got some geographical issues with Smith Level Road and the bypass, which that locks that school into an area that's hard to develop. We would not recommend putting another 500 student school back on that site. We believe that based upon new environmental standards, that we would not be able to build a 500 on there. But it would be a great site in the future for either reconsideration for shared use with the town of Chapel Hill. It is in Chapel Hill, though it's right on the Carville line, or it could be a great site for a program that our district might have. But as far as a 500 student comprehensive school, it's less desirable for us to be able to pursue once we are able to replace the children, move the children out of Frank Porter Grant. Morris Grove is a school that I want to talk about a little bit more tonight. The land that's actually deeded to the district is very limited, but there is a substantial amount of land that the county owns for a future Twin Creeks Park, and I will talk about how there are future opportunities for us to consider in a handful of our scenarios. So in Morris Grove, I've got two illustrations. One's from the GIS system, but the other is just from a master plan from about 15 years ago. And you see Morris Grove at the top, and I would draw your attention to the image on the right. Morris Grove is the orange image. Just to the south, you see that there's a red line that goes all the way down the property. That is the sewer easement, but it's also a trail that allows walkability for the communities that are to the south of Morris Grove. When you look at the land that is directly to the south of the school, that is an ideal location to build an addition, or what you're going to see in a future scenario is a dual language center that could be built on that site. At the same time, if you go below the white line that goes left to right, that is an electrical easement. There's land just to the right of the park that you see with the ball fields. That land could be considered for a future middle school site. What I will say is there's a few things about this site that I will say can be dependencies for a project. One, I don't think this one is a major challenge, but the land is zoned as rural residential. I don't believe, knowing that the county ultimately designated that this property could be used for future educational use, that would be a difficult challenge to rezone. But at the same time, along the right side of that property, they show a connector road. And if you've been to Morris Grove, when you pull into the school, you see where there's a stub out that ends. That is the connector road that ultimately would be connected with the Lake Hogan community. And what they do here is they show that that road just goes around the property. Well, there's a lot of hard right turns there. They just did that to show you need a road. It has not been engineered. One of the challenges, I think, in looking at option one, where we do say put a middle school on the site, is we would have to work with the town and the county to design a road, and we would have to pay for that road to get down to the lower portion where the middle school would be located. So it would eat into cost, but it also, there's more coordination and time that would need to occur. Not that it's unattainable, but I do think that that is a barrier that we would need to have to overcome over time. We would look at this site. The park is not in concrete. It's a concept, and I think that the county, in talking with them, they would be very open to shared use of fields if it ultimately became a middle school in 15, 20 years. So I think that that's something that we can hold in reserve, but there is viability below Morris Grove for opportunities where you could relocate or build new facilities. So looking at community input, we've received a lot of input, and it's all been good because it's what we needed to hear and to learn, as you mentioned, Andy and I going out and engaging. But all the emails and communications and phone calls that we've received, I've tried to capture just the four major categories that have come forward. That there have been others. But the first is that our community, I've not had one that has not recognized that our district buildings are in need of repair and replacements or improvements. I think everybody is on the same page when it comes to that. They've asked to include community input on how the plan can be done, and this is part of that process. They've asked us to maintain school walkability and to minimize disruption to the best of our ability. There's been a lot of mention about plans that both of our towns have respectively. Those are public plans. We are fully aware of the walkability and how that is a strength within our community. And our goal obviously is to balance our needs with what those desires are. So our goal is to be able to tonight, to be able to show you what our preliminary assessment is so that you can see where some of the scenarios hit the mark or where there are challenges when it comes to either disruption or walkability. And then as a whole, folks have asked that ultimately at the end of the process to ensure that we are assessing the impact on racial and ethnic groups. You know, clearly, two of the schools that have come forward are dual language schools that have a larger percentage of Hispanic students. And we want to ensure that we're not doing anything that would single out a single group. Our goal is obviously to take anything for our students, to put them into newer buildings. But we just need to be cognizant of the fact that there are large numbers of children of color that we just need to be aware of as we move through this process. So the bond plan options. I'm going to do my best to walk through these, and I've created some animations so that you can follow through, so that you're not just looking at a flow chart that you may have seen the last time. Got some great feedback from some of the community members on how to best share this. This is option one that was presented at the last meeting, so nothing has changed with this, aside from the fact that we've added some language at the bottom just to give clarification, but I want to walk through this. This is the plan where we ultimately convert the McDougall Elementary and Middle School campuses into a dual language campus. In doing so, you've got to build a new middle school next to Morris Grove, then ultimately move McDougall middle students out of that school and put them into a new school, which still leaves you students at McDougall Elementary. What this plan does is it would reassign those students from McDougall Elementary to schools that coincidentally have the greatest capacities within that area. Those are Morris Grove, Carborough, Northside, and even Scroggs to a degree. They all have ample seats that have adjacencies to that school community. What we're not suggesting is taking students from McDougall and moving them all the way over to Rashkis Elementary. We're trying to keep, if we have to disrupt students by displacing them for a proposal, we want to make sure that we do our best when we work with our demographer down the road, that we're just moving kids to adjacent schools and not making them cross multiple boundaries, if at all possible. In this plan, once the dual consolidation occurs at the campus and the students have been displaced or reassigned at McDougall Elementary, this opens up FPG, which allows FPG to be a temporary swing school, knowing that FPG was one of the schools that had one of the largest recommendations for replacement. After we build a new Carborough, the students would then be reassigned into the new Carborough, and then at the same time, it's not dependent upon the first project. The original plan talks about replacing Culbreth, and then using FPG potentially as a swing school even for that site. And we know we can't put all the students into that school. We think we can build it adjacent to it, but we may need parking. We may need some field space while they are doing the construction at Culbreth. So it's an asset that we have, and it's very close to Culbreth. So we wouldn't want to take that facility offline until we knew that we were out of the thick of it with the replacement of Culbreth, given its proximity. In the end, ultimately, FPG would go offline. Again, that's a term that, not to mean any disrespect as far as our children, it's just taking it offline of our school inventory. That is a program school where the children would have been put into a brand new school. But with Estes Hills, I just want to give clarification that it's never been in our thoughts to ever close Estes Hills permanently. But knowing that we are about 1,000 seats underutilized at the elementary level, and that Estes Hills is a school that ultimately we've got to do something with, the initial thought is, knowing that there's not enough money to do all of the projects that were identified by Woolford, is to, at least minimally, toward the end of the bond plan, to take Estes Hills offline and reassign those students with the explicit intent that in the next referendum, at the time, Phillips and Estes Hills would be the top two projects that would be done. But it's the idea that we're operating a school that we're pouring money into, and we've got, at some point, we've got to try to find a way to minimize that investment. My biggest concern with FPG, Carborough, and Estes Hills is that in between whatever plan is decided, just hope we don't have a catastrophic failure with one of the systems in those schools. You know, we're going to continue to invest, but there's a point where you have to decide, do you replace that roof? Do you replace that full air conditioning system? Or are you able to still repair it, or do you have to reinvest? It's just a balance, and we just have to keep that. And our maintenance teams have played a big role in letting us know how much life they believe they can get out of our schools. All right, so here we go. I'll go through this very quickly, but for option one, you build a new middle school. You move the McDougall middle school students into the new middle school. You move the McDougall elementary students to other elementary schools with capacity, again, adjacencies. You unify all the elementary dual language Spanish programs to the McDougall campus. You then empty out FPG as a result. That allows Carborough to swing into the empty FPG for about 2 years or less, depending upon how quickly the project can be approved. You build a new school, and then once that school is built, all the students from FPG will then return to a brand new Carrboro Elementary. After which, you're able to begin replacing Culbreth Middle, the goal of keeping the students on site to the best of our ability. And then we build a new school at Culbreth and those students return. At that point, you can move the students ultimately out of Estes Hills to newer schools, with ultimately the plan in the end, and we're talking about in the end would be 9 to 10 years from now, would be to take FPG off our inventory and then ultimately have a plan to replace Estes Hills with the next bond referendum. Now, we'll talk a little bit about there's dependencies with Estes Hills and Phillips, but obviously we think Estes Hills and Phillips are very similar in need, but Estes Hills, obviously from the consultant's perspective, has surfaced to have the greater need. So what's different here today is you're going to see an option number with the letter A, and I'm going to call that a wild card. It's an option of where we can reevaluate one of the schools in the renovation. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because in the option 1A, nothing changes until we get to Culbreth Middle School. So I'm going to jump. This is exactly what you just saw in option 1. But instead of, when you move the Estes Hills students, you reassign them. I had mentioned that we would do that in option 1. Instead of renovating or replacing, Culbreth Middle School, you would actually tear down Estes Hills because you just reassigned those students, and you would build Phillips before you build Culbreth. So this is the wild card where you're just switching out Culbreth for Phillips. And I'm going to get to the point in a few options where I'm going to explain how we can still help Culbreth in the long term, but also some justification of why we believe in working with the consultant that Phillips should at least be taken for consideration, knowing that Phillips is in the critical path to replace Estes Hills. So the sooner we can get Phillips replaced in these scenarios, the sooner that Estes Hills can be ready to be actually, if it's sold on the next bond referendum, designed and built, Phillips Middle would not be in the way of that path in order to get that accomplished. So again, you see the same plan where it's just with FPG and ultimately Estes Hills in that, knowing that we've added Phillips. So I'm not going to go through all of these because this is something where I think you will see graphically, but obviously with option 1, the advantages we've talked about in the past with Spanish dual language all at one campus. You're able to put all of McDougall students into a brand new facility. You are reducing the age of your portfolio. Several of the McDougall students, knowing that if Carrboro Elementary was to consolidate, there's 300 seats, brand new seats, that would allow 300 students from McDougall Elementary to go to Carrboro Elementary. So 300 of the 500 McDougall students would ultimately go into a new school when that time comes forward. What you're going to see, though, what I want to share are just the disadvantages. The disadvantages here are that one, you're going to displace 500 students at McDougall Elementary. That's a disadvantage. That's a disruption. The new middle school, it is less walkable compared to McDougall Middle. The location of it right now is not, from a residential standpoint, is not infield with a lot of residences within the area. The town of Carrboro has been making a lot of planning and a lot of strides for interconnectivity with its trails. So ultimately, they're planning to allow the Morris Grove school area to be very well connected with the existing and future trail systems. So you are decreasing the walkability. And then obviously students who used to be able to walk to McDougall would not be able to walk to the new middle school next to Morris Grove. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach when it comes to that as far as a challenge. The walkability of the new dual language school, that will also be limited. If McDougall Elementary Middle becomes the Spanish dual language, only the children that by choice and lottery that live within the walk zone of that building would be able to walk to that school. So it does have a tremendous impact on decrease in walkability. At the same time, bus transportation, when it comes to the number of routes, that would require a substantial number of routes, and we indicate that on the metric at the end. I will say out of this, option 1 is probably the greatest lift for our transportation department, because you are taking an elementary and a middle school And you are creating several more routes that are necessary because all the students that were originally walking would now have to be bused to the adjacent schools or to the new middle school. So from a walkability transportation standpoint, option one doesn't have passing college when it comes to those two primary criteria. Though it does help with efficiencies, it does help with putting our students in the newer buildings. It does not help when it comes to walkability and transportation. At the same time, with the 1A option that I shared, where we basically took Colbreth out, there would be no monies that could be reinvested into Colbreth with this plan here, with option 1 or 1A. You're going to see in the other plans that Colbreth, there is investment that we can make, because if you build an elementary school next to Morris Grove or a dual language center next to Morris Grove, that costs less than a middle school. So there's about $20 million difference in cost, and that $20 million could be reinvested into Colbreth, and we'll get to that in just a few slides. All right, so option 2. This is the second of the dual language consolidation. There's only 2 before you tonight. These are the only 2 that I think potentially are viable solutions. Again, I'm not suggesting that they're the solutions we would recommend, but they're viable. The first is to, next to Morris Grove, knowing that you would convert Morris Grove into a dual language campus. That means the school, Morris Grove, would no longer be a comprehensive elementary, it would become a program school. In doing so, the dual language consolidation is every bit of 850 students. Morris Grove can only hold 500 students. So we would need to build an addition, a building on the land adjacent to Morris Grove Elementary that it minimally could accommodate the additional 350 dual language Spanish students at minimum. My recommendation would be we would build for a little more capacity than that when you look at efficiencies, but that's to be determined. This would require that the Morris Grove students would be assigned to adjacent schools with capacity. We would then have to relocate all of the dual language, and I failed to mention our small newcomer program at Northside that was mentioned previously, as well as FPG and Carborough. They would all combine to Morris Grove campus, where you would have an addition adjacent to Morris Grove, and then that's where the dual language. So it's basically doing what we suggested at McDougal Elementary and Middle, except you're just adding an addition to Morris Grove in order to accomplish the same idea. This then allows you then to continue by emptying out FPG. You can then use it as a swing space for Carborough. You can replace Colbreth on site. Again, use FPG as a swing site, and then in the end, taking FPG offline, and then ultimately reassigning Estes Hills and replacing that school in the next referendum. So again, I'm going to walk through that very quickly. Moving the Morris Grove students to adjacent schools, building a new addition next to Morris Grove, moving the dual language and newcomer programs to the Morris Grove Elementary dual language campus. At that point, you're emptied out FPG, which creates space for Carborough and Northside. Carborough Elementary students would swing into FPG, and then we go right through where we build a new school, return all the kids back to Carborough. We replace Colbreth. Again, option 2 is replacing Colbreth. You're going to see option 2A that we're going to swap it with Phillips. And then again, you build new Colbreth, come down, do the same thing we talked about, knowing that in the latter years of the plan, you would reassign the students knowing that another referendum would be coming, and you would be able to put Estes Hills and ultimately in option 2, putting Phillips on the forefront. So in option 2A, again, I just want to share, when you look at this online, you don't see the animation, you just see the full flow chart, but it shows here where instead of going to Colbreth, you're now tearing down Estes Hills and building a new Phillips on the Estes Hills site. Now, knowing that we've taken the option of building a middle school at Morris Grove, here's where you get your roughly a $20 million savings. And we would recommend that you put some of that money into high priority projects and high impact projects, and I will name a few of those in some future slides at Colbreth. So 2A actually allows you, by taking Colbreth and not replacing it, you can still reinvest in that building and give it life to where that building could go another 15, 20 years. We have confidence. And again, we've spoken with Wolpert, who believes that it's possible as well. So why replacing Phillips Middle makes sense? You know, Phillips Middle, built in 1962, it is a critical path for future school replacements, meaning that though it's not part of this phase bond plan, But if we could tee up and get Phillips done sooner than later, it gives us the ability to then replace Estes Hills, which then allows us to start hitting the remaining schools that have needs, such as Sewell Elementary, Glenwood Elementary, Ephesus Elementary. It allows us to get to that in a future bond referendum. But Phillips is within a critical path, and it's a vital part of that community and revitalizing it, knowing that, as I've said before, I will say the Estes Hills community is in the epicenter of our school district, meaning it's in the center. It's a vibrant area that you would never fathom ever putting anything other than comprehensive schools at those locations. It'd be great to put a program there, but not on that site. But if there was another piece of land, which I'm not aware of, you'd want to put that in the middle if you could. It just doesn't exist. So you would not put a program there at the expense of a comprehensive school. At least that would not be my recommendation. Because of a centralized location for our transportation services and the community that's already built around it and it's been there for many years. So, Colworth Middle School. Actually, let me go back. There are about $8.9 million in high priority needs that Wolpert identified for Colworth. It's primarily HVAC, roofing, and electrical. By doing that work, you can reduce their FCI by 14%, takes it to below average. But at the same time, below average actually is operational for our school district. I mean, that's just where we are. It's when you get into poor, when you're at a point where you're not able to operate. And you go back and look at the slides that Wolpert created, you will see that. But at the same time, there's opportunities there with that $20 million savings that we could do some high impact finishes, fixtures. So not only do the roofing, do the HVAC, the electrical, but we could also go in and look at taking some of the funding to renovate the bathrooms, to renovate the library, the cafeteria, the kitchen, the office, give it the improvements that it needs. I will challenge anybody, go to Phillips, walk through it, go to Colworth and walk through it. With not knowing anything about facilities, I will say, tell me what you think. You would think that Phillips is far worse. So from an FCI standpoint, Colworth was higher than Phillips. This is where I say you can't put all your tools in one cart here. The difference is there's been money invested in Phillips over time. But those investments, we're going to disagree with Wolpert and say that ultimately the HVAC at Phillips, the roofing at Phillips, ultimately is going to need to be replaced. Structurally, I don't want to get too many details here, but the difference between Colworth and Phillips when it comes to HVAC work, Colworth has rooftop units. If a unit goes, you take it off the roof, you put another one on it. At Phillips, there is no clearance between the ceilings and the roof. So there's no way that you could replace it with a modern day HVAC system. There's no place for the ductwork. So we have outdoor units on that school. Right now, they are 3-ton units per classroom. You can no longer buy the 3-ton unit. This is where I'm getting to the weeds a little. You have to buy 2 1.5 tons, which means you pretty much, the decibel level's a lot higher, and you're eating into indoor classroom space because you have to have 2 units in the space of 1. It's a little thing, but that's a big thing when it comes to the instructional integrity of the classroom, but also from a maintenance standpoint. So that's just one little example, but the topography, Colworth is flat except for the gym. The topography has challenges at Phillips from flooding in previous years to just ADA accessibility. Though we have that accessibility, it is still a challenge. And if you've been to Phillips, you know the kids eat outside 365 days out of the year if they had school for that time. I mean, they're there in the cold and the winter, the summer, anytime they can. If they're in the building, they're eating outside. So the campus and topography are challenges, as well as the access to the football field. Soccer field, that is a tremendous challenge for any child with a disability to get down there, and they have to make alternate arrangements. And again, if you haven't been there, I encourage you to walk that school. Just compare the two. But they both have needs, so I don't want to dismiss Colworth, but I believe that we can accomplish something at Colworth and make this a consideration if we chose to accelerate Phillips ahead of Colworth when it comes to replacement. I think the critical path is necessary. At the same time, I'm going to put out there, and I said this to the consultant, I think they missed the mark with the Alice Gordon Science Wing. Just under a 15,000 square foot addition, built just under 10 years ago at about $4.7 million. That's an investment. That's an asset. And it's on the exterior of the building. It's not a separate building. So if you tear down the school, it's going to be very tough because you're going to have to, we have to occupy this building and build next to it. Kind of hard to salvage that addition. And that would be a shame, I think, with taxpaying resources. But the fact that When you look at Colbreth, I won't go back to the slide, but the educational adequacy at Colbreth was much better than Phillips. The rooms are sized better. And again, if you go to the two schools and compare, you will see that as well, that the educational adequacy at Colbreth. So we just believe that Colbreth, that the county is saying they don't want to renovate, they want to replace. As long as we address the high priority needs that Wolpert has addressed, and they see the educational adequacy, which was, I will say, a huge cornerstone for our Board of Commissioners to say adequacy of the educational environment is very important, and that's one of the rules of engagement. It allows us to consider this, because if they had not said that, it would be very hard to consider it. So I think it's a plausible opportunity. Here are just some of the examples for the public to see. I've mentioned it already as far as the high priority needs, but then some consideration for high impact projects over the course of the next 10 years. We don't have to wait on some of these projects. You know, unlike we were talking about replacing it in latter years of the plan, you could begin doing these upgrades as funding allowed within the bond availability of funding. So it's not something you would wait all the way up until year 7 and then start doing this, because this is all very impactful for a school that's occupied. So you want to try to do this over time. All right. Option 2, considerations. These are the advantages and disadvantages that we have just talked about. I'm not going to belabor these. Option 3. This is the first option where there's no Spanish dual language consolidation. So we've left the consolidation arena. We're now jumping into just replacing the schools that have the greatest needs. And in option 3, we make the suggestion to build a replacement Frank Porter Graham dual language center on the land adjacent to Morris Grove. So we're not talking about putting a 350 student addition now like we talked about in the past. It's just replace the school. It's where we have available land. It is a program. It's a program that ultimately, though you would only put 500 students in it, it's 850 strong. We don't envision this program over the next 10 to 15 years. The enrollment may swing over time, but I can't imagine that it's going to drop to where you wouldn't be able to support a school. It's just that strong within our community and with the enrollment. So we would recommend doing that, which that would then allow you to vacate FPG. You would build that new school next to Morris Grove. It allows you to replace Carborough to continue to use FPG as a swing school. Again, here's the 3 version where you replace Colbreth, and then ultimately you're still doing the same with Estes Hills and FPG in the end. Walking through it, I'm just going to scroll through this because I think everyone got the idea. Option 3 is where we throw in, instead of Colbreth, we go right to working with Phillips. And again, this is a plan where, because you're building a school that's $50 million versus $70 million middle school, that's the savings that you could use to put into high impact projects at Colbreth. So Colbreth's still getting what it needs to be a vibrant school. But again, it's trying to maximize the use of the resources given the assets and the conditions that exist at Colbreth. So with option 3, I will tell you that for 3 or 3A, it was tough for us to find disadvantages for both of those. I'm not saying that they don't exist, but just from our exercise, there were advantages because it allowed the replacement of Phillips to allow a quicker replacement of the phase 2 projects in post 10 years. It addresses educational adequacy at Phillips. You're not building a new middle school, which then allows you to capture that money to reinvest into Colbreth, so Colbreth is not left behind. You have less movement of students compared to the other plans. In essence, you're moving about 350 pre-K through 5 students at Estes Hills in comparison to some of the other schools that were at the 500 range. Not saying that I'm not minimizing the disruption here, but it is less students that you would have to physically displace. You're still reducing the average of the facility and the age. You're maintaining the walkability at the McDougal campus, ultimately versus taking that away permanently. And the goal, obviously, with Estes Hills and with Phillips would be to allow that walkability to continue, though the replacement would be staged over time. And it minimizes the use of additional bus routes. That's a big one because you're not busing students by displacing them at the level you were with the previous proposal. So it's better. Option 4 is build a new Frank Porter Graham elementary school next to Morris Grove. It's the same as before, except in this case, what we're doing is we are instead of replacing Carborough, we are moving Estes Hills students into the old FPG. So again, the funding only allows you to do 2 elementaries and a middle, 3 elementaries or 2 middle schools and an elementary. So you got to just look at the funding. In this plan here, there is no disruption to students because you're just building and then moving kids. But in this case, you're able to do Phillips instead of Colbreth and Carborough. So you're able to accelerate the Estes Hills Phillip campus, but it is at the expense of Carborough and Colbreth not being replaced. What I will say is I just talked to you about how Colbreth could have work done that would allow it to maintain. I think a challenge here would be leaving Carborough Elementary behind, because in doing so, school built in 1958, it's got similar challenges, high percentage of Hispanic students, it's got a program, but if we do this and we want to reuse FPG for the replacement of Carborough 10 plus years from now, we got to keep FPG operational as well. So we got to maintain Carborough for a long period of time, but we also have to maintain FPG. I have concerns over it from a sustainability standpoint of being able to do that, but I at least wanted to show this is an option that you can do if the board was to choose. It is doable, and again, I didn't want to show anything that was not doable as an option. And I will give an example in just a moment. So here's what we go with option 4, build a new FPG. You move the students, you swing the Estes Hill students into FPG. It is a hike, meaning it's a drive. Our transportation department believes it can handle the lift, but it is a challenge, but it can be overcome. But this allows us not to have to reassign students at Estes Hills. Then that allows you to build Phillips on the Estes Hills site, and then ultimately you can tear down Phillips and then you build, ultimately you swap the 2 and you build a new middle school. And just scroll through, and then ultimately in the end you're taking FPG offline. Estes Hills has been replaced in this case. So with the advantages here and disadvantages, I think that it accelerates phase 2 because again, you're addressing Phillips and Estes Hills, which means in the next referendum, you can focus on Sewell, Ephesus, and Glenwood. Potentially, if you were able to, the idea of however we replace Estes Hills and Phillips, if we did them both at once or if we did them over time, it would be to build one school and design it to where you have the ability to connect it, the elementary to the middle school or the middle school to the elementary school. Instructionally, you could explore looking at a K-8 model, instructional model, not only for Estes Hills and Phillips, but you could consider it ultimately if we don't reassign the dual language program at the McDougal campuses, you could look at that as well. But there are a lot of operational efficiencies if we were ultimately to replace Estes Hills and Phillips, to try our best to try to connect the 2 schools over time so that there could be shared use of the library, the media center, shared use of the cafeterias, shared use of some of the athletic spaces. There's obviously some efficiencies, and we've seen that at McDougal where you're able to at least capture some of those efficiencies over time. And then you've got the whole instructional piece if you want to look at a K-8 model. Currently, McDougal does not operate in a K-8 instructional model. They're connected physically and we have the operational efficiencies, but from an instructional standpoint, they're not doing anything that's unique to K-8. But again, that's an opportunity down the road. The one thing that I would like to say is when we get to the criteria here, though the first 2 plans have dual language consolidation as far as you do it immediately, the other plans, be it 3, 3A, and 4, those plans don't take dual language consolidation off the table permanently. You could still consider, if you built a replacement dual language school next to Morris Grove, but you left Morris Grove intact as a regular school, down the road you could consider reassigning the Morris Grove students and making that into a dual language school. You have that ability looking at the demographics of our district, the enrollment. It doesn't just take it, you're not doing something from a facility standpoint that precludes you from at least looking at that down the road. I'm not suggesting that what you should do with dual language. But it does, I just want you to know, it does give you that opportunity where you're not missing an opportunity if you don't choose 1 and 2 to ever consider it down the road. The opportunity does exist. But graphically, we've given some definitions of what our team looked at when they looked at transportation, they looked at walkability, we looked to see if there were physical Chapel Hill Transit bus stops near our schools, and we kind of walked through and created just a stoplight approach here. And what you're going to see, obviously, on this first slide is we've got to meet, the non-negotiables are the county requirements. You have to meet the principles of the Wolpert Plan. The SAFO compliance, SAFO is the process that our district uses, the county uses, where they hire NC State to come in and to look at all the plans of developments that both Orange and Chapel Hill Carborough that are in our communities for developers. They look at the yield, they do their projections for student enrollment. So they take all the information, we do CAPS reports that you see periodically where a new development is coming, and we project what we believe the student yield would be. That's part of the process when we work with both respective towns that they require of developers. SAFO process looks at all of that because the county is charged with the building of new schools for capacity, so they manage our enrollment projection. Now, be it with Wolpert, we asked them to do the same thing, and I think I mentioned in the last presentation, Wolpert and the SAFO, both of their independent work really looked a lot alike, to where it showed that the SAFO process was actually yielding what we were looking for. The only difference is Wolpert looked at educational adequacy a lot more in the SAFO than the SAFO process did. So the numbers they're warm, but they're not different in nature, as some of us thought that it might be when they did that. When you look at educational adequacy, that's where when you replace schools, you're resizing them appropriately, so you've got all greens. And then I'm just going to jump right over. So here's where dual language shows its ugly head. When it comes to the transportation impact, which was a lot of the feedback that we received from the community, that impact on buses, and I say bus routes, not drivers, because we have drivers that do multiple routes. So it's not a matter of having to add drivers, it's a matter of adding routes in many cases. And with a lot of these moves, there are efficiencies that are created, or there may have been kids that are not walking or walking today, and other kids may be walking as a result when it gets redistricted. So it's not just a one-way approach here. But when it comes to transportation impact, increasing student ride time, potentially, especially on the old 86 corridor going up towards Morris Grove, the traffic impact for having buses and cars, because we do have a high percentage of parents that drive their kids to school. So you're just adding that traffic to that. Public transportation access, we chose yellow because they all have bus stops that are near their facilities. Morris Grove actually has one on the site. McDougal does not have one in the front of the school, but if you go on Hillsborough Road and you go about a block, 2 blocks down, there is a bus stop. It's not ideal for someone because they still have to walk a 10th or a 20th of a mile to get to the school, but it's accessible. So we just put yellow there to say they're there, but in some cases they're not right in the front of the school. If there were parents that needed to attend an event for their child or meet with a teacher, and Chapel Hill Transit was the only means that they had. We wanted to show that because Chapel Hill Transit has done a pretty good job of providing bus stops at many of our schools. And though we don't have elementary students, very few ever using Chapel Hill Transit. At the middle of the high school level, we have a lot of students that utilize it, especially at the high school level. So we wanted to include that, knowing that that's valuable to us. The walkability, the school impact, obviously when you consolidate schools and you take walkable schools and you change them, you're going to impact that, and it does decrease the walkability. So that's where the optimization plan that Wolpert looked at really did not hit the mark. Of course, they were not asked to look at that. They were asked to look only at efficiencies. But again, this is what we see as we start looking at this more holistically. And then the last piece, this one, facilities optimization impact. Clearly, everything that we're doing, it's going to improve our operational efficiencies. If you take an old building, put new equipment into a brand new building, you're going to save on your utility costs right off the bat. You're going to reduce your portfolio age. You're going to increase or improve your FCI. The one where you maintain future middle school site, the first plan where we actually built a middle school next to Morris Grove, you take that away for future consideration if enrollment was to change in 15, 20 years. But all the other plans, if you just build a dual language center or an addition next to Morris Grove, you still have that land to the south that can be considered to be used. So I leave that there because I think we can't predict the future, but one thing we do know land's it's gonna be even less available as we increase in time, is what I would suspect. So I think that's an important piece to keep in consideration. I also throw out there that in that area, you do have the green track that is going through design charrettes, community meetings as we speak. Potentially that could be a site for future school use consideration, but it would only be for at most an elementary school, because it is shared use with rec and parks and with the school district, the land that's available. So it's not a huge swath of land at all, but it's enough to where you could build a north side elementary type model on it. So I just keep that out there, but that's to come. And then obviously, looking at addressing school capacity and enrollment distribution, option 4, where we're not reassigning Estes Hill students, no students are being reassigned in option 4. You're really not addressing any of the imbalance that exists in our elementary schools. Not to say that we could separate this out and say, let's not look at redistricting with the bond. Let's just look at projects with the bond. And let's look at program optimization or redistricting down the road. You don't have to rip that Band-Aid all at once. You can optimize that over time if you so choose. But with some of these, if you do what we're recommending, you would have to reassign students with some of these. But ultimately, we could try to do our best to minimize that and to stretch that out as long as possible. But option 3 and option 4 are the ones that have the least impact when it comes to disruption. And with all that being said, I've said a lot. I've probably missed some things. I'm sure I have. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I know that you've had questions that you've been waiting to ask, and I'm going to answer those. And if you have transportation questions, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Stewart, has been gracious enough to talk about transportation as he's worked with the team, if you've got questions about that. The one thing I do want to add is there's been a lot of talk about us not collaborating with local agencies. And what I will say is we collaborate when it's necessary and at the right time. So when we look at transportation, we supported the grant for safe routes to schools that Chapel Hill ultimately, who got a person, as well as Carrboro that has been doing it for 10 plus years, safe routes to schools. We work with them on a monthly basis. We meet and we talk. So a lot of the walkability is coming from a lot of the information that the principals are providing, but also the planning departments in both of our respective towns, the information they've shared with us over the years and even most recently. But even when it comes to the ideas that are being presented to you, we will engage. We know the public plans that are out there for walkability and getting around. Those are public documents. We fully recognize the values of this community as an operations team. I think the appropriate time, though, is once we decide the projects, the what, when we start talking about the how, that's when we are going to be totally engaged with the plan of development for all of our jurisdictions that we're working with. Because not only do we have to work with Carrboro and Chapel Hill, but we've got to work with Orange County as well. And there's certain tasks that Orange County does on the project that then maybe Carrboro and Chapel Hill will do. So we've got to be engaged with them when the time is appropriate. And we have architects and engineers that are on staff that are able to work that process, to talk the language, but also to be able to find that balance. But I think that adding all of the input that you've received in the past few weeks, this is that part of that process where it's just where do we want to go in the next step, and trying to, again, accomplish where you've got far greater need than the means that you have. And again, I'll leave that to say I'll answer any questions that you have. Mr. Chair.
Al, thank you so much for the alternatives. I'm just going to give each board member a chance to ask some questions and just be mindful that other people want to have a chance as well as we narrow it down. But to the board, I would ask you to consider one thing and address it in your comments, if you would, so I can get a sense of where you are. That is possibly removing the dual language options off the table if you're comfortable with it. But again, I'm just putting that out there if you would address where you are so we can get there. I find myself landing toward 3 and 4, parts of 3 and 4 myself, but I'll let everybody have a chance to talk with you.
Okay.
Ronnie, you can go since you had your hand up. We'll just go this way and then this way.
Al, this is fantastic. I so appreciate how easy you've made this and how the clarity with which you presented everything. So thank you. I know how much effort this took. I think it's very important to take FPG offline. So to me, that would be almost a non-negotiable. That's one of our oldest schools, and we would just be pouring money back into that if we tried to keep it online. So I'll say that. I think it's also important to address Carborough Elementary School for the same reason. I'm, fiscally trying to think about how the best use of funds. And I would also like to prioritize dual language consolidation. I appreciate you saying we could think about that in the future iterations. I would say my early priorities are FBG and Carborough Elementary. My question is, in option 1, this is a 10-year plan, so can you talk about the timeline in which we would be moving to Estes Hills? I know this is all approximation, but is it 2 years, is it 8 years?
I want to give it an approximation because wherever we land, we're going to have to work with the county because they have their debt financing, which they pretty much kind of put out there already. But realistically, in option 1, the first thing that you would have to do is you'd have to build a new middle school. That's step 1. You'd have to design, get the money if the bond's approved, and they're able to use some of the PAYGO money on July 1st of 2025. We would immediately start working with the architect to design the new middle school because you got to build the school first to start the process. So you've got a 2-year lapse right there, minimal, just to get that school under construction. To design it, take a year to design, barring any challenges in the planning departments. But then you have to build the school, and that could take up to 2 years. So that's 3 years out right there. So you've got 3 years. Once that happens, though, when you're looking at that 3rd year and you might be opening that school, you're ready to move the McDougal Middle kids in. You also got to be looking at, okay, now we're ready to have to reassign the students at McDougal Elementary to other schools that have adjacencies so that somewhere in that process you would then move all the kids onto the dual language campus at McDougal. At the same time, the new students going to Carborough and the students that remain in Carborough, the non-dual language, they're all going to go to FPG in the beginning. We wouldn't want to move the displaced students to Carborough and then say, okay, you're going to be there for 6 months and then we're going to move you again to FPG. We'd want to move them all at once so that the Carborough students and the new students coming to Carborough would get moved all at once. Now, I will tell you that is easier said than done. Our bench isn't that deep when you look at all the movement that it would take in one summer. And it might be that you have to do that during the middle of a year, you have to do it at winter break. We're going to have to figure that out, but the goal would be to minimize the movement. So once you do that, and if you can do that at the same time that you're moving the kids into McDougal Middle, you've got that piece, dust settles, you're building Carborough at that point because you've emptied it out. At that point, the next critical path, as far as movement, is you go do Colbreth. But you don't have to finish Carborough to do Colbreth. It's not a dependent project. Colbreth is actually an independent project. It could stand on its own, and you could do it, and it's not going to bother anybody. The only difference is we really need FPG as a possibility for some flex space for parking, storage, or anything. So we would generally want to wait for Colbreth to be after Carborough's complete. After that, the decision to take Estes Hills, I'll say to reassign the students versus saying offline. To reassign those students, that's really a decision that has to be looking at what we're putting into the building. Is there a problem where that air is not going to last? We got to get the kids out, or we have to reinvest and put, $1 to $2 million into an HVAC system for a school that ultimately we're looking to replace. You got to look at that. But ideally, what we've always said to everyone is my goal would be to wait, because if we're going to reassign the students, I want to try to keep the kids in Estes Hills as long as I can, because the next bond referendum, you want to get the kids out the latest you can, so that if there's a bond referendum and the board at the time and the county puts Estes Hills as the top priority, then at that point, the lapse of where the children have been reassigned is maybe only 2 to 3 years at most, and then you get the kids back into a new building. So if you do it on the front end, I would say we do it because we have major maintenance issues at the school and we have no other alternative. My idea and what we told the community is it could be 6 to 10 years. And we would do everything we can to keep that, because we're not looking to disrupt students. But at the same time, we got a building that we know is just as bad as Carborough, just as bad as FPG, and it's a disservice when we know we have buildings that have better facility conditions that have empty seats. And again, it's a balance, because don't get me wrong, the children and the staff at Estes Hills and many of our schools, they're dealing with the maintenance issues today, every day. So they're used to it. It's par for the course. And I think we would want to keep that community as a whole as long as we can, because that's the idea. Is if you get the kids out and then you have the next referendum, you're not delayed by a redistricting process that slows the process down. Because we want to get, again, this plan is setting the stage, I think, to hold people accountable that if we're going to do this in phase 1 and we're planning to do this in phase 2, that we're committing that we're going to do the phase 2. And we're saying it publicly and we're putting it on a document so that when that time comes, someone has to have a compelling reason not to follow the phase 2 plan. Maybe something else changes, right? But you have it there, and we've never done that in the past. And I'll use the example. Carrboro was considered in the last referendum, and it didn't get done. That's why I believe Carrboro, it needed to be done in the last referendum, and it wasn't. So Carrboro Elementary, excuse me. So it's a matter of, I just believe we have to make a commitment to our citizens that if we say we're going to do this, this is what we're going to stick to, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable by having it in a public document. So that when that time comes, they can reference it right online and pull it out and say, why are we not talking about this today?
I agree. And then one last note I'll make is I would prefer to look at Phillips rather than Colbreth, because I think then we have a completely rebuilt Estes Hills Phillips campus once we get Estes Hills built.
Barring any other scenarios or changes that we make, our team believes that doing what we've recommended as my option A, my wild card, that's the best thing to do as far as taking care of Colbreth but getting Phillips ahead, because that is the critical path that gets us to the next. And it really holds us accountable to say, all right, we did Phillips, now where's Estes Hills? It holds us accountable to it. And it gets us moving forward.
More questions?
Well, that's fine, yeah, just let everybody, and we'll come back around. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was a lot of information to take in. Start. One thing I wanted to get a sense of, I just want to step back from the discussion of all the different options for a second, because I've heard a lot of conversations about like how many, the big quote unquote biggest walk zone communities. And it just struck me that, elementary schools like Scroggs and Rashkus also have big walk zones because they were built, as a part of a community when they were built. So do you have any data, and maybe that's an Andre question, on kind of how many people do actually walk to school, or what percentages versus take the bus versus drive, to the extent that you can? I just wanted to wrap my head around that data a little bit more.
Yeah, so from a qualitative standpoint, we do have certain schools that have greater walkership and car ridership. Our program schools have the greatest ridership by parents. Sewell, FPG, Carrboro Elementary. And then at the middle school level, it's basically where you have Colbreth with dual language middle school, and you have Phillips with dual language for Mandarin, and then you have McDougall Middle School with middle school. So you see the car ridership is far greater at those. Dr. Stewart, what he can provide is just what are the students that are who are the students in the non-transportation zone where they would be eligible to walk? But we do have some preliminary qualitative data from our school routes, safe routes to schools folks. They've just begun doing that, but we do have some counts from, specifically we looked at the schools that were being impacted. So we have some qualitative data that came from both towns, grant coordinators, when it comes to the schools that are being impacted, be it McDougall, Estes Hills. We have some rough data from the principal from Estes Hills, and then we have information regarding Carrboro that we could provide. But I'll let Dr. Stewart, depending upon what information you're looking for, the qualitative of what we've identified in the system, or if it's just a ballpark idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to get a comparison, essentially, just to understand about what was truly our version of these.
So looking at the way we've had to tease this out is to look at it through bus ridership and look at it percentage-wise per school. So we really have two tiers with it when it comes to bus ridership. So we have the schools that are above 50% of ridership and the schools that are below 50%. So when we look at that below 50% that have a higher walking and driving capacity, we're looking at Carrboro, Ephesus, Estes, McDougal, and Scroggs. Scroggs, you brought it up. Scroggs actually has 80% of its population will walk or ride to school. So they actually have the highest when it comes to it. All of these schools have 30% or less bus ridership. All of those other schools, the other elementary schools, are above 50. So as Al was alluding to, those program schools are in the 60s. FPG, Glenwood, they're gonna have those higher riderships. All of our middle schools are above 50% because of their program. So when you look at it, and then we break it down even further to look at the actual amount of buses that we send every morning to those schools. So Scroggs has 2 buses that we send in the morning. McDougal has 2 buses that we send in the morning to the elementary school. Middle school has 14 buses that we send in the morning. So we look at it from that perspective rather than breaking it down and trying to tease out how many actual cars we have versus how many walkers we have.
That gives me an idea.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you. And then I've seen a number of messages and had a number of conversations where Lincoln Center has been brought up. And so I just was wondering if you could briefly address that and kind of why Lincoln Center might not be a school site versus could be. I mean, I don't have a good sense of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So several years ago, there was a plan where the district hired an architect to consider putting a pre-K program on this site in addition to having space for Lincoln Center administrative staff. This building that we're in currently by no means could ever accommodate any of our elementary schools, from the smallest to the largest. The building here, it doesn't have a cafeteria. It does not have any classrooms any longer. I mean, you would have to be totally retrofitted. But the plan calls for basically at the time, it was a 400 capacity, about 100 for staff, 300 for pre-K, that would be built in the front of the school as the first phase. The second phase would be to tear this building down to create parking and accessibility for vehicles, for people to park. What you've got here, though, is you've got the Lincoln Center, and there's acreage out here. There are setbacks that we would have to follow, building out here. We do have the Phoenix Academy, which is a building right over here, literally. And in order to do something here, you're gonna have to replace the Phoenix Academy. So the plan that the architect developed several years ago was to do this. We have a very substantial warehouse and facilities department that's on the lower part of the hill down here. We would have to find a new location and replace that, because that's where the architect said the Phoenix Academy would have to go. You would move that down there. But you'd have to replace your warehouse. Now, in the plan, they never discussed where would you find land and where would you build a warehouse with a bunch of maintenance vehicles and trucks that potentially a community would even accept within their community, right? It's a challenge. In doing so, you would then have to put money into the admin here. Now, I've seen things where we could all telework, we could all go work in the school, so I'm not gonna say that that's the barrier. The barrier is that, on top of that, there's just not enough land here to put a 500 student school. And the biggest challenge that I see, and it's the number of vehicles that would be coming here for 500 students. Because over at FPG, we're basically, this is identical to the other side on the other side of the bypass here. You're landlocked, you got everybody coming in one way, and the number of vehicles that are coming in, there's not enough internal stacking on the site, which causes the vehicles to all block on Smith Level Road twice a day. And it's pretty substantial if you've ever gone through it. There are multiple accidents, there are multiple people who are walking that have near misses. We are constantly working with the towns, the police, with our Safe Routes to Schools folks to try to improve it, because there's a signalized light there, there's a crosswalk. It's still challenging. Moving it over here and not being able to have the acreage to put the vehicles on the site, as I suggest, as if we built at Morris Grove, we would do that to prevent there from being additional congestion at Morris Grove, because we've got the acreage to add the vehicles. Here, those vehicles are gonna be on Merritt Mill Road, and they're gonna back down to the bypass exit for Merritt Mill, and possibly even go down to where Greensboro Road is. that's a challenge. But at the same time, the county, in setting up their guidelines, it's a two-pronged approach, they basically said that the money needs to put kids into new schools, but it has to be in alignment with the Wolpert plan. So building a new Phoenix Academy is not part of the Wolpert plan. I have challenges of this money, be it so limited or need is so great, to investing in adults, investing in a facilities warehouse, and using bond money that's supposed to be putting our kids in newest buildings and doing that. But it's really about the limitation that we have here with the setbacks. But then there's other parameters that have been added that were not there when the architect did it several years ago. But would this site be a great site for an alternative program, be it an alternative school in the future? A future Lincoln Center / Phoenix Academy where it's larger and it's expanded? This would be an ideal site for that right here. It would. This is good real estate. We should not ever get rid of this real estate here because it is centralized and it's enough to where it's established and everything's been built around it to where anything we do here, it's within an existing community.
It's also
If that
an important
helps.
part of our history, so it makes sense.
Yeah, and well, I didn't even talk about what we would have to overcome in addressing the building that we're in right now, given that school's history and its presence of how we would preserve that history and going through that. Because, you know, this is an original building, there's a gymnasium that's attached to it. The community here is still very strong and very closely tied to this building and its history. So it's a process we would have to go through. Again, I don't know what that would be, but it would be a pretty extensive process, I think.
Thank you. That's
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah, but that's a great, people have offered that, and I like the fact that people are offering ideas, they're viable, and it's that people are thinking, they're trying to find proactive ways to give input and to develop ways in which we can try to minimize disruption, so I welcome it.
Thanks.
Did you address George's question about dual language or not?
I didn't, and I don't know yet. I'm of mixed opinion about that.
Okay. All right. I don't feel strongly about needing to put dual language in a single spot, at least not quickly, so it could be done later in the plan. I'm drawn toward option 3 or 3A. I don't like the problems with 4 with FPG being like kept online for so long. But yeah, so I'm leaning toward the 3s more than others. Also, an amazing amount of work that you guys did in the past 2 weeks. I can't say enough, and it's already been said, but wow, yes, that was very helpful.
And just for clarification, for the option 4, it would be Carborough Elementary.
I mean, yeah, sorry.
That would not be
Carborough-
bypassed.
Right, Carborough would just get left out altogether, but FPG, we would have to keep running for a long time.
Yes.
Right, and that part I didn't like either. Yeah,
Thank you.
sorry.
Fine. Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing for me is the temporary transportation piece, Al, that I don't want us to underestimate that, so that was the one thing I hesitated on option 4, is that you would turn an entire school that probably has a significant, non-bus ridership into now
Yeah,
one that could shift.
you would be, in option 4 scenario, unless parents brought their kids, drove them down, we would be transporting all. And I just have to add, option 1 is the same challenge because in option 1, that's a heavy lift of increasing the routes, increasing the ride time, but at the same time, you're gonna have to transport Carborough Elementary to FPG as well, and they have a very large number of walkers, so that's why I use the word, it's a heavy lift. And option 1, for us, as we look at all of our needs, is probably the least desirable from an operation standpoint because it's just such a heavy lift. But that is a challenge, and if we mitigate that piece on the front end, that heavy lift, if it's Carborough or even if it's Estes Hills, our transportation staff, they feel very confident that they can manage that, though it is enduring. It's a big ask.
Yeah. And I'm not, maybe I need to sit with option 4 a little bit more, but I think some of the challenges, like Mike said, with Carborough sitting untouched and we'd have to keep FPG viable for such a long time, that makes it really tricky, right? It's just, that's not great, right? And obviously keeping in mind, I mean, I didn't realize Carborough was part of the old bond plan, right? It was in line next as a school, so I don't want us to lose that either, right? Like, I don't want to keep kicking, plans down the road, because obviously there is some valid points with that. So when I'm looking at these, I'm taking a step back and thinking about our facility portfolio, right? And thinking beyond this year and looking out in 30 years, right? So what we end up with, do we have a portfolio that sets us up for whatever is to come? And that's why I don't necessarily love option 3, putting, for whatever reason, 2 full-size elementary schools beside each other, which made me start to consider option 2 a little bit differently, because it's just an expanded elementary school, right? And going back, I appreciate how you brought in the land map on slide 17, because for me, it creates an opportunity, because we'd have to build that road out for the extension, right?
For the elementary or the middle?
Elementary extension for
Yes.
option 2.
For option 2, it would be minimal compared to if you built the middle school, you'd have to go much further down. But you would have to build.
Yeah, it sets the table for if we decide to do something with the middle school, right? So then at least we have started doing the road work out there. And it's not like we have to do it all at one time, because that's expensive. So at least with the option 2, we start doing the road work, we break that up a little bit. We put an extension of an elementary school there. So that I think for that reason, I do like that option, and I like it. It is and isn't for me, George, dependent on dual language. It happens to in this case, but it's addressing elementary schools for me, right? It just so happens FPG is dual language. It just moves an elementary school population over there. I also think, but I'm curious with option. So with 1A, you're saying there wouldn't be any funding available to even do anything at Carborough.
At Colworth.
At Colworth, sorry.
That's correct, because the money would be going into the middle school, so you wouldn't have any savings. Nor could I recommend that you take some of the money that's been dedicated for high priority projects for the rest of the district and cutting into that, because that is just as essential, if not more so. Yeah.
But then also with that one, the middle school on the land, we would build it on that lower portion. We'd still have that land site immediately adjacent to Morris Grove. Potentially, if we see population increases, we can add an extension and make a Morris Grove larger.
Potentially. I think that would be part of the discussions between the town and the county.
Right.
And with the designers to see, if they may come back and say it's more cost effective to put something right next to the school versus to the south. But for my sake, I wanted to show that the acreage is there and that it does show that there's educational use of this to be rezoned. But it does leave that, but I will say this, from a developer standpoint, you always wait for someone to put the water in the sewer and then you build, right? You put the sewer, they will build. The sewer is there, the water is there, but the first in always pays for the road. So we would be putting, it would be a substantial investment, and that would erode into the cost of the middle school. The roads are not cheap to be engineered, and the process you have to go through once they're designed to be able to get those approved. It could slow the process down. I don't want to say it won't. When people all have the synergy and they're all motivated to get things done in the community, things sometimes can move a little quicker, but it's a challenge. That's why I say option 1 is probably, from an optimization standpoint, it does hit the mark, but from a community value input, but even a developer standpoint, it's tough. I don't want to oversell something that's going to be where I have to underdeliver on it. it's accomplishable, but it's not easy. But I think it hits all those other areas pretty rough.
Vicki?
Thank you.
I think for me, consolidating dual language is not a super high priority. I think I'd be concerned with what the population of a school that large with that particular program would look like, in the community. So, I'm not super pressed about that, but in terms of moving students and from different areas of our town, I would be more apt, I think I'm more leaning towards the threes as well. I would be more apt to not just look at the walkability, but the community aspect of the campuses. And I know for me, thinking historically about the fact that if you're looking at the 54 West area and that side of town, those kids have never had walkability from being on that side, but with the McDougal's campus, they are now in schools that are finally closer to where they are historically. They came, before that, they were in elementary school they were spread out, either at Frank Porter-Graham, Carborough, sometimes even Sewell, depending on where they needed to spread them and put numbers. So they were being bused. With the addition of McDougal, you had kids who no longer had to go that far, and they didn't have to go to Cobra. So that brought them back even closer, and it's still a little ways for some because that area backs up to the next school district, of course. But it still allows them to be in one location with a whole area of our district. And I think that's important and needs to be considered because that's a population that's been bussed around a lot. So, and then with the apartments on that side of Carborough, that's to be considered as well. That's a large population of that side, and that area keeps getting numbers. So, I think that's important. So it's not just about the walking, but the fact that that area serves a very, diverse area in terms of the type of students that come into that campus, and that means a lot to me. I know I went to Carver Elementary. I also went to Essex Hills. I also went to Glenwood, and it wasn't all because of moving. It was one move, but two of those was because of busing and redistricting because of they needed numbers to be somewhere else. So I understand what that looks like and what it feels like, so that when we can have the most bang for our buck with the less impact, I think that's important. I think we also need to look at how much marginalized students have to get pushed around in terms of going from school to school historically in our district, and that has been done over and over again. And I also understand the aspect of you saying about when you said we have to have it on paper so that if we say we're gonna do this project, we're gonna do it and they can hold us accountable. Well, I can say historically speaking, Chapel Hill High was on paper for a long time. And they still kept kicking that can down the road to eventually it got so expensive that we had to build that school at the cost of not being able to do some things to the other schools that were supposed to be done, and it was on paper and in place. So I have memory of these things, lived experience. So from that doesn't sell me to say I have faith in just because it's on paper that holds it accountable. It should, and that's what we need to be assured that that's gonna happen, that what happened in that situation won't be happening again, because it was kicked down the road so far that they ended up having to turn the school around and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, I digress with that. So I say that I think you guys have done a wonderful job bringing back a lot of information. Bottom line, I'm less pressed about consolidating. Like I said, the dual languages, I'm more concerned with being able to keep students together in certain areas as much as possible. I think Phillips and Essex Hills should be rebuilt. I know what Phillips feels like. I can understand how much of a problem it is to keep replacing HVACs there. The school wasn't built with air conditioning in the first place, so it wasn't built to have it. So, I mean, we used to get out of school early because there was no AC. Colbert was the better built school. I mean, it had AC, it had carpet. We understand what that looks like. So, yes, it is time. I mean, you had to hike up to get to the softball field at Phillips. I know that playing softball, you had to run down to get to the football field. So I understand that these things need to happen. So, and it didn't have for people who don't know, because they always say McDougal's the only school, middle school that doesn't have a auditorium. Phillips didn't have one. It didn't get one until the 80s. So, you know, so let's be clear. It wasn't there. It was a big deal when the money came to put it there. So, I think we have some good plans in place, and I think the 3 options would be best, in my opinion, to serve our community at large in a meaningful way.
Thank you, Vicki. Al, let me ask a couple clarifying questions, and then I'll go back around with people. And also, just as a point of process here, we're not trying to make one decision tonight of any kind. We're just trying to narrow the field down to something. Maybe that's one option, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3. And we'll continue this in July at the next board meeting. So there's no pressure on anybody to feel like we're trying to get one option only, because then I guess that's not an option anymore, if that's all you have. But with that said, I just want to clarify, with option 3, we get a new Frank Porter Graham, a new Carborough Elementary, and a new Culbreth. Is that correct?
With option 3.
3. And with 3A, we get the Frank Porter Graham, the Carborough Elementary, but this time it's a new Phillips.
With a new Phillips, again, you would have to reassign ST's
I
middle students,
understand
right?
that. I just, because
with-
I'm all of it.
And I always have to say, I don't want to be remiss to say, with that option, there is money that you can continue to invest in Colbert, knowing that you've swapped it out from replacing it to, I'll call it a high-impact renovation, to where you are contributing. So that option does allow that as well.
Okay, thank you. Just trying to get clear. And on option 4, there's a new Frank Porter Graham, there's a new Phillips, there's a new Estes Hills. Are we fixing up Carborough Elementary and Culbreth? Did you say that?
So you have, potentially, you would still have the same savings. But Culbreth, I would say you could invest in, because we're saying that you don't need to replace Culbreth. That's one of your options. Carborough, you would have to put money into it, but it would be money just to sustain it, because your goal ultimately is going to be to replace the school.
Understood.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we can go back around and just, people have more questions, please feel free. Doesn't have to. You don't have them, you're not forfeiting your right later. We're going to get this right one way or the other. Yeah, go ahead, Rita.
I'm focused on transportation, so with option 3, we would essentially be transporting kids across a significant part of our district to 2 elementary schools that are beside each other, correct? Because Morris Groves has a lot of students who ride the bus, and then you'd have all the FPGs, so then you would then we'd have to look at staggered schedules over there or something.
So, just point of clarity, yes and yes, but you already transport the majority of the students at Morris Grove, so you're not changing anything in that model. But by putting a program, a dual language center next to it, you will have added traffic, you'll have added cars that are coming, yes. But they already have it at FPG. From a transportation standpoint, instead of going to the southwest quadrant, you're going to the northwest quadrant. So if you're at Rashkus, you're either going to go this way or that way. You're going to pick which way. And for me, I would be using Waze and saying which one's quicker based on traffic, because and Tim's here for us. Because you're going to decide, because if you're coming from Rashkus and going to Morris Grove, you're probably going to take the Weaver Dairy extension, but you're going to be on 15501 for that little choke point in the morning where it takes about an extra 5 to 7 minutes. So the transportation would be looking at to find what's the greatest efficiency. But staggering the schedule, we've talked about that from transportation, that if you did that, you might want to stagger it by 15 minutes, just so that you can help balance it. Though when we build a new center, that was what we were doing. Again, I don't want to minimize, we're going to do everything we can to put more stacking for that school onto the school site so that you're not competing and having vehicles that are backed out to the roundabout that currently is right there on the road. Yeah.
We're already transporting 63 and 60% of those schools already.
It looks like in your dot charts with green, red, and yellow, you've got 3 or 4 different criteria for consideration. It looks like option 4 has like green dots a lot of places. And option 3A and 3A also do, like they meet a lot of the criteria that you've set out.
It does, because when it comes to a lot of these impacts, it is mitigating it. It is. It's just at the expense of other schools that are not getting done.
Bigger
That's,
ones are on the last slide 45, where
Yeah.
you got the red and the yellow.
yeah.
So you would maintain FPG for 10 more years and not touch carbon.
That's important.
Then option 4.
So we don't,
Empty rooms.
we chose, again, we tried to be as objective as possible and not lead anyone to believe that we're trying to slant it one way or the other. But when it comes to, a category that ultimately we debated creating was ease of construction, some type of facility piece that you would add in. We just didn't want to compound it. But it is, option 4 is the path of least resistance, but there are some inherent challenges that will come with that. Aside from the fact that you got limited money, and I'll say it, a lot of the love is all going to one campus, and it's at the expense of other schools within our district. It's just trying to find that balance too. You just got to decide. But in saying that, I mean, we know that Phillips is the critical path to get to Estes today. And that's an important piece, and that's why we put Phillips in, because we recognize, and that's a commitment. To your point about putting it on paper, you build Phillips and you replace it, you've made a commitment that you started that process, and there's a need from an educational adequacy standpoint and a facility standpoint. And you got more kids, you're addressing more kids by doing a middle school, you're impacting more children because there's more kids obviously in the middle school than in the elementary school.
Is there board energy for like doing something like keeping options 3 and 3A and 4, or maybe 4 is out, I don't know, on the table, and let us come back and have some time to just read and think and learn and talk about those? I'm just trying to narrow this a little bit.
I mean, it sounds like operationally 1 has the most complexity, and so maybe that's one that we start to deprioritize.
Just push it off the
1 and
discussion.
1A.
Yeah, again, not pushing you to make a decision, but I think any clarity you can give as far as anything that you believe is just not palatable, that helps our team focus on what's important. And again, I've said, I believe option 1, it doesn't meet the mark. When you incorporate all the values that are there, if you had to remove one, that would be the one that I would recommend based upon our assessment and where we see what's viable for our district and moving forward.
Is that 1 and 1A?
1 and 1, I would remove both, because both would be the consolidation. It's moving the McDougal piece out, just taking that off the table.
So one question to the board is, could we agree right now just to do that as a way of starting to get this narrowed down a little bit? I'm getting nods. Everybody's saying okay. I'm gonna just use this sort of consensus model tonight, and let's just take 1 and 1A out of the discussion. So we're down to then 2, 2A, 3, 3A, and 4, or maybe somehow you come up with 5C or something.
No, I will say that, we're not,
I know, I'm trying to narrow it. I didn't mean tonight.
I think if another viable solution comes from the team, I would at least like to have the ability to share that with you as we go through this process. I am not saying that this is the solve all here. And there could be others as we develop and we continue to do more diligence. There could be other options, and I would like to reserve that. But by giving some direction as far as an option, what I will say is for the public's sake and for your sake, whatever we do, we're gonna keep the numbers that are there, the letter and the combinations, so that they never change.
Thank you.
And if we add one, but if we take one away, there just won't be a 1 and 1A anymore. We're not gonna make this confusing for people. But yes.
I have a quick question again with, regards to dual language at FPG. Those kids are coming from all over the district already, so what percentage, are bus riders compared to people that are taking their kids to school?
60% at FPG.
Are bus riders?
Yes.
Okay. So if they were on the other side, that would probably be give or take about the same.
Same,
All right.
yes, ma'am.
200 parents dropping off, what you got in the program. Or 200 cars.
Meredith, Ronnie?
I'm looking at my Estes Hills people over here and sensing some, I don't know, it's some sadness or something. And I have a soft spot for Estes being a grad myself. Could you, if we went for an option where Estes down the road was a project that was sort of put on hold and those kids were redistributed to other schools temporarily, I mean, what could we do to ensure that they feel better about the situation, that we could make sure that you know, we have some sort of commitment? I know that we can't predict the future. I just said that in a meeting with some Estes folks the other day, that, you know, we don't know who's gonna be in office on the Board of County Commission. We don't know, you know, there's a lot of unknowables at this point for the next phase of a future bond. We don't know what the economy's gonna be like, but what can we do to show good faith that we're gonna rebuild that, that community's school?
So I think a powerful message, if it pans out to that direction, is the replacement of Phillips. It's starting the commitment versus us saying, the original plan said, hey, trust the bureaucrats, we're gonna replace your school, right? It's just there, but by actually doing it, it demonstrates that. But beyond putting it in a plan, I mean, no one can hold who's gonna be elected officials in years to come, but it's there. And I think that the county, they asked us to develop, both of us, both districts, to develop a short and a long-term plan. So they've got some accountability on their end. You know, what I will say to you tonight is, I'm not about disrupting the environment for a community either. Nothing good comes from redistricting. Nothing. That's where my gray hairs come from. I promise you. Nobody, I get it. I don't want my kids to move. It's a reality though. We used to get a piece of paper saying your kids are going here next year. It's a reality. So what I would say is, you know, we would make an effort to keep the children in Estes. If nothing else happens with Estes Hills and we don't have to reassign them because we're going to do a Phillips, we'll say nothing happens, we would want to keep them in that building as long as we can, as long as it is a safe, conducive environment for learning. And it is today. Children are thriving in Estes Hills, and they're pivoting and adapting, and the staff is when things happen. We would continue to try to do our best to maintain that, but we can't look past the fact, because when we go back to the county and we're asking for money and they're going to say, well, you didn't do this and this and this, we will have an uphill battle as we're trying to get more things accomplished. And so we've got to honor the report, but we want to balance that with keeping our children intact as long as possible. You know, I will say this, we could have just not put Estes Hills on the plan. We could have just let it go and said, we're not going to optimize our district. We're going to continue to operate with 1,000 extra seats and we're not going to touch it. That was the optimization piece that Wolpert was asked to do, and there wasn't enough money to do it all. So they said, well, basically, just ultimately take that school out of the inventory and then put that into phase 2. But we could have just left it out totally and just been silent with it, because it's not part of the critical path to get the other projects done. But it is setting the stage for the future. And that's the piece that I feel compelled to do and to provide to you, as here are the options, here's the North Star, like it or not, and then we try to find a way in which we can adapt to that, that's something that's palatable for our community and what are the values of our community as a whole and for you as an elected official. I mean, it's a balance. But I think we've made great progress in moving that and getting the feedback that we needed, because this is what we would have expected to hear. And then we've had some great ideas that have been interjected as well that has allowed our team to reflect on that.
is there any sense that we want to deprioritize option 4, given our outside of scope?
Yeah.
What do you think, folks?
I would deprioritize option 4.
Does that mean like stop talking about it? I'm serious.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me.
We're taking it off the discussion.
Well, that's
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So Vicky, where are you on that?
I'm okay with that.
You guys are okay with that?
I wish we could do every school. Yeah, I mean, I felt reluctant, but yeah.
Right. Yeah, we all, yeah. So that brings us to just having options 2, 2A, 3, 3A sort of in play. Is what we're agreeing to. And what I would suggest is that we could stop there tonight with those and let everybody have a breather and start looking at these, and don't feel compelled to send us emails right away to the community, but you can. Well, I'm just joking. If that's where the group is tonight, we could stop there. And Al, is that agreeable with you at this point? You've done a lot of work in a short
Absolutely,
time.
and again, I'd like to reserve the right to continue to work with our team, to receive feedback, to ultimately see if there's other palatable scenarios that, what would my goal be? Find a way that you could consider as an option, consider and replace Estes Hills without moving the children. Because Estes Hills needs to be replaced as well. It's just competing with all these other needs that are just as important. It's just, I wish we had an extra $30 million. Because we could do it if we had 30 million more, but it's just a matter of that. So again, this clarity helps our team immensely in focusing and fine tuning and beginning to talk with some of our other agencies and stakeholders to be able to say, now we're getting a little closer, let's talk a little more versus let's talk about 10 different things. Let's talk about 3 or 4 different things.
Okay.
It gives us that ability.
Okay, so then, in terms of, I'm sorry, Reese.
Oh, I was gonna say, so what I could additionally use some clarification on, you've mentioned about coming back in July, we have a virtual meeting, of having information to present at that point. I do wanna say that as far as us progressing, moving forward with the county, who obviously has approved on the 18th, they approved the agenda in order to go to the state and to put on the ballot, everything. We've just got to work towards a target of, in the end, I would say by mid-August at the latest, a final decision that we can give the county that, not how we're going to do it, but these are the schools that we're going to focus on. Because I know that they'll be starting the education committee. People will start getting into, September is when the education committee really wants to go out and do presentations, start talking. So I think as a target, we've got July and as late as the first meeting in August, I think, to try to get something, because the county, anything that we amend, because they said we can come back to them, they would have to call a special meeting to be able to do an amendment so they can move forward. And I always say that because they do not meet in July and August. They come back in September. So if we get our piece done, we've got to work with them to get a meeting set so that they can amend it, and we can at least begin moving forward with the what as finalized.
And I've been in regular touch with Chairman Bedford, the commissioner chair, and she's actually would prefer that we wait till August to ask them to get another meeting in place so they can have all 7 of their commissioners present, and she's willing to do it. So what and I'm making the process up as we go, but what I propose is on July 18th, which is our next board meeting, that we continue to discuss these options with a goal of continuing to narrow it, perhaps even to 1. But we're not going to decide at July 18th, this is the final end of the road decision. We can do that the first August meeting and then still take it to the commissioners. And we can give the commissioners heads up on how to schedule their special August meeting plenty in advance. Does that sound feasible to you?
It does, from the conversations that I've had with our counterparts.
Okay.
Yes.
And to board members, does this sound feasible to you at this point? Let's do a plan, and we're clear what we're saying tonight about this process, because that's been a little part of the problem up until recently, is our process hasn't been real clear, the board process. So I want to make sure we leave, everybody goes, I get it, we're going to talk about these. And if we can, our goal July 18th is to narrow it. It'd be great if we narrow it to 1, but even then, we're not voting on it. clear enough, then that sounds great. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to say again, thank you to you and Andre, and I cannot tell you how happy I am to be able to be even having this happy problem of what schools we get to fix.
Yes.
Right? Like, I've been sitting in this seat since 2016, literally crying as I walk through these school buildings, thinking about the condition that not only our students, but our staff go into every single day. And so the fact that our commissioners went through this year-long process in collaboration with Chapel Hill schools, with Orange County schools, with Orange County staff, to come to a intentional funding plan. We have never had this in the district in probably 20-plus years, where they said, we understand the needs of the school, we understand the plan, and here's how we're gonna go fund it. And so I am thrilled. It is a happy problem to have to say, like, which of our 1960 built schools do we go fix, right? And to Mary's point, we wish we could do all of them. But I appreciate the thoughtfulness of your plan of, like, thinking about the phasing, thinking about swing space. We can't start to rebuild a school until we have space to put students, and that's the swing space concept. And being thoughtful about the timeline. And so I am just super, I want to shout out Commissioner Jean Hamilton, who led this entire idea of the Capital Needs Committee. We have been working together for probably a year and a half, again, county commissioners and Orange County schools, and she has just been so instrumental in developing a process where we can all align on the facility assessment condition, and then start the commissioners thinking about how to pay for this. We came up with $1 million worth of needs between the two districts. $1 billion, yeah, thank you. I wish it was $1 billion. We could do all this.
We're used to getting $1 million.
Right. And the other thing I'm excited about is not only are we talking about a strategic renovation plan, like new schools, but we're also talking about maintenance capital, which we've not done before. And so they're thinking about how to fund that on a regular basis. So I just want to be so grateful to our county commissioners, again, Jean Hamilton, and thank you all for the questions and feedback and advice. And I'm just excited about what our schools are going to look like in 10 years.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you.
We appreciate that immensely. Just very quickly, is there any committee reports or anything, Sharon, that anybody needs to get in?
No, George,
I can read the room. The meeting's adjourned.
Congratulations, graduates, is all I'm saying.
Too late.